Let's start Northern Europe. And as we typically do, start almost every chapter in this book with a map. And you'll notice that chapter 24 started with a map of the Vatican, which was really kind of the central power. This is 17th century Europe, Portugal and Spain over here. But you see all of this stuff here, the Republic of Venice, the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, Papal States, Parma, Tuscany, Milan. So I was talking about city-states. Their government had not really changed, and it won't change for another couple of hundred years. And in Central Europe, what is today Germany, was still technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't organized as Germany, Austria, Hungary, etc. Poland was a country. So was France and England. Kingdom of Denmark and Norway, that's the, how should I say this? A lot of people don't understand that when we talk about Nordic culture, we're still talking about Denmark, because the Danes are really part of the Nordic culture. But anyway, this is what it was. And we start up here. This is in Europe. This is in Northern Europe. This is in Nuremberg, in Germany. And I sure wish it were darker in here. What you see in Northern Europe, in a big way, as I was saying on Monday, you can kind of tell the difference between the Catholic and the Protestant philosophy, the life philosophy. And here we go. This is Vanitas, still life. And you see this shiny metal sphere, and the reflection conforms perfectly to the shape, to the surface of the sphere. We got here, this is actually a clock, a mechanical clock. All kinds of things, you know, and what Hockney was talking about all of that shine, it was like a clue on how they were able to do this. And you can see all of this just done exquisitely. And so I want to put this up there, Vanitas. This is kind of a vocabulary term, a symbolic work of art showing the transience of life, futility of pleasure, and the certainty of death. That's really kind of a Northern European Protestant way of looking at the world. You're only going to be here for a while, and it's sinful to have too much pleasure. And in that culture, I mean, there were a lot of things that they were, how would we say it today? It was really kind of getting very conservative, even to the point where some denominations of Protestantism, they didn't really, well, we see it still today. Some religions here in the US did kind of frowned on drinking and getting drunk, dancing, stuff like that, pleasurable activities. They were frowned upon. The futility of pleasure. It's a big waste of time. And so contrasting symbols of wealth and symbols of ephemerality and death. So life is passing. Its transience is displayed right here in this clock. And you see this little key down here? That's what you would wind this clock up with. So it's a spring, it's like a watch, it's like a early kind of watch, but it's a more of a clock. And so the empty glass, whoa, we got a skull here. We have some music here, you know, and it's, I don't know. It's a morality, and an allegory is something that very similar to this, an expression of truths or generalizations about human existence by means of symbolic fictional figures and their action. We saw one last week, time, Cupid, love, Bali. That was an allegory. And so this is really what a lot of the artwork is about. And that is right out of ancient Greece and Rome. Allegory of the cave. This is like sort of the granddaddy of allegories as we know them. This is from Plato, and basically what, anybody of you heard of this on some other classes or anything? The allegory of the cave. Good. I didn't see everybody raise their hand. So, well, basically, help me out, you guys that know about this. Basically, these prisoners were put in a cave, and let me, oh, it's not going to let me zoom in. I've been cheated. Anyway, over here, these are the prisoners, and this is the fire, and the prisoners are held captive. This is allegory. This is like a fictional work of literature, but here's go down to number 7 here. Plato's point is that the prisoners would be mistaken, for they would be taking the terms in their language to refer to the shadows. And see, that's the whole thing of the allegory of the cave. They didn't understand that they were being held by other people. The only thing they knew about their captors was that the shadows would be cast upon the wall, and they thought the shadows were their jailers, if you will. And so basically the point of this allegory is that you kind of only know what you see, and if you don't see the whole picture, you may not be getting the whole story. And so anyway, but an allegory, and that's oh, come on. There we go. And so I got this one too. This is Baroque. The definition. And the reason I have to bring this up is because actually Baroque has a couple of different meanings. And first of all, it is a artistic style, especially in the 17th century, that is marked by use of complex forms, bold ornamentation, and we saw that with the architecture on Monday. The ornamentation, and especially on the interiors of these churches, there was no surface untouched. It was ornamental to the max, and the juxtaposition of contrasting elements, often conveying a sense of drama, movement, and tension. Contrasting elements. Whoa, what would that be? Based on what we've seen. How about this? that extreme light and dark, tenebrism, Caravaggioism. That's about as most contract, that's about as good an example of contrasting elements as you can get in painting, that extreme dark and the stark light, contrasting, and to convey drama. You talked about that, movement. And generally they try to, as I was telling you about Bernini's David, right there at the point where he's about to unleash that stone to kill Goliath. He's all coiled up. It's the point between potential energy and kinetic energy. That's tension, that's movement. And so anyway, here. Second, characterized by grotesqueness, extravagance, complexity, or flamboyance. Whoa, that doesn't sound like very flattering. But here is why I bring that up. A lot of people do use the term Baroque for excessive complexity, extravagance, and so on. This is the number one is really the first definition, but this extravagance, and we'll see this a little later, we'll see extravagance play out. It'll be one of the legacies of the Baroque era, because especially in France, they will seize upon that extravagance and they'll move into another period and style called the Rococo. And that is extremely extravagant. And it's extremely, in a lot of ways, decadent. But at any rate. So, allegory of sight. This is Bruegel and Rubens collaborate on this painting, allegory of sight. And as I was saying, it's there to kind of show that things are temporal, that life is transient, that everything exists and for what it is, and it exists as symbols. So the allegory of sight, what the heck's going on here? Well, we have here a depicted classical Greek nude. She looks like somebody perhaps right out of the Sistine Chapel ceiling or out of ancient Greece or Rome. Here she is, and she looks like the classical nude that goes back 2,000 years. And we have here this angel nude holding up a picture. And then you start to see all of this other art all around here. It's an allegory of sight. And I would guess, just my interpretation, but my guess is that Bruegel and Rubens are setting up this allegory to pretty much say sight is in the eye of the artist. And this is the different ways that people, places, and things are represented. And, you know, see predominantly paintings all over the place. But we also have a lot of sculpture over here. And then on top of that, make this out. That's a globe. That's a whole different way of seeing the world. How about over here? A telescope. got Galileo in trouble. But bottom line, you could see the stars, you could see celestial bodies, you could actually get a pretty good idea of what the moon is. And so we have all of these other things going on. We have some devices, measuring devices here. We would use for drafting to say mechanical drawing or plans or blueprints in the modern vernacular. And let me see if I can get a zoom on this, because this is one of the funnier parts of this in my mind. A monkey. And so, yeah, the drafting equipment, money, printed material, painting, sculpture, globe, etc. And here, we don't know exactly what that is, but that may be a window out to the outside world. Anyway, all of these things have to do with sight, has to do with perspective. The monkey part, what would you think that had? What was that all about? Any idea? Any guesses? These guys were pretty clever, you know. Monkey paintings. Actually, monkeys start to show up in a lot of this Baroque art. And it was something that David Hockney actually analyzed in the long version of Secret Knowledge. So, how about this? The idea of what does all of this mean to a monkey? Because this is a human construct. And would these paintings fool a monkey? Probably not. Would the monkey be able to understand this as a model of the world? Nope. The drafting equipment, would they understand these sculptures as people? Probably not. Philosophical question. Why am I dwelling on this? Because I like monkeys. And another thing, this question actually comes up in the 19th century in American art. There were a group of people that we'll see later. Some of you actually wrote about Bierstadt, the guy who did the large landscape panoramic paintings. Well, he was part of what was called the Hudson River School, and they were landscape artists. And they painted huge paintings, and they were thought to be in so correct, so realistic that they posed a question. Would it fool a cow? If you had this big, huge painting of a pasture, would the cow try to walk inside the painting? Of course it didn't, but it was called, they had a name for it. It was called the innocent eye test. And that's really what's going on here. The innocent eye test. Doesn't know about any of this other stuff, but would they be fooled into believing that, say, this painting here is actually a bunch of ships at sea? No, probably not. Probably not at all interested. So anyway, Baroque, they do a lot of things. Rubens is one of the great artists and put together some of the adjectives I talked about. We just showed you about Baroque. Contrasting elements. Well, he's doing this. He's got that extreme light and dark. Movement. Elevation of the cross. Not like the cross standing up on Golgotha. Inert. Static. Not moving. But at this moment, again, right at the point between potential energy and kinetic energy, they're trying to lift up this cross, and you can see everybody struggling. And the theatric. Oh, those of you who know about Christian religion and the story of the crucifixion, what does Jesus do on the cross? Before he dies, he says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And the idea is that Christ himself is speaking to God the Father, looking up, and that's what's going on here. That's what Jesus has his mind on. A lot of the other tricks of Baroque art, the anatomy, the shiny objects, all of this stuff. I put a star by this one because Rubens is really one of the premier painters of the age. And consequences of war, again, another allegory. And what is he doing here? What really happens in war is a lot of death, a lot of destruction, a lot of orphan children, a lot of women losing their partners. The struggle, the carnage. Oh, and this is another Baroque idea. Death. Death shows up all the time. And so death as something that they're fixed on, that's kind of part of the Protestant way of looking at the world. We don't see that quite so much in the Catholic Southern European countries. We'll see a lot of martyrdom, and we'll see a lot of things. The arrival, this is kind of interesting. Oh, I can move this out of the way so you can read it. Rubens, the arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille. And of course, all of the gods from the sea, and they are bringing her in. She's on the ship, disembarking. Angels with trumpets. Marie de Medici. So, what's so special about Marie de Medici? Well, she was a descendant of the famous and very wealthy Medici family. The de Medicis were from Florence, and they were merchants. They were very wealthy, and they pretty much financed the early Italian Renaissance. And so that's why in the 15th century, you see all of those great artists, and they come from Florence. And then at the turn of the century, the Pope kind of pulls them away. But the Medicis are still rich and famous. They are like, who do we have these days? It's hard to have a modern equivalent, but like the Kennedys or something, a lot of money, a lot of power. And she's arriving in Marseille, which is in southern France. And so anyway, Garden of Love, another allegory. These angels, they come up in Rubens' work all of the time. They seem to be always guiding or playing a part in the activity depicted in the paintings. And so here's another notable painter of the time, Van Dyck. Charles I at the hunt. Royalty, good life, but not that excessive. Not like he's sitting on a throne, not like he's wearing jewels. a crown that would weigh about 10 pounds full of diamonds. And so, yeah, even, Clara Peters, again, there's these still lifes and the idea of life being transient, that the transience of life is really in its own way, kind of like everything in this painting. Still life with flowers, goblet, dried fruit, and pretzels. But the transience, what would that be about? Flowers, they're not here forever. They will wilt, they will die. The food, it's there, it's in its prime, it's useful, it's good. But after a while, that'll get stale too, and it won't be any good. Pretzels and so on. Dried fruit, another metaphor for life itself. The calling of Saint Matthew, we've seen that. We've seen that with Caravaggio. We see the lights and the darks, and the contrast is here. It's right out of the description of Baroque, but it's not set up like a Caravaggio. Caravaggio, dark in the distance, light up front. Now he's kind of playing with having some dark areas up front. This figure here, spatially, this figure is the closest to the viewer, and he's dark. We have that light coming in through the middle. And that'll be something that a lot of these artists will develop in this century. It's not all just stark black and white pushing forward. They really start to play around with light and space. I've seen, doesn't say this in the book, but scholars, I've known a few that try to describe the entire Baroque era as the age of light. Light was not a simple thing. And if you take a look, say for instance, like Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, anatomically maybe exaggerated, but correct, maybe a little idealized, but you don't see this modeling of space. You'll see the modeling of the figure, right? And they seem to be three-dimensional, but it's almost like the background is just kind of there. These artists, and inspired by Caravaggio, and that's documented, largely start to play around with this. So Baroque, another definition, the age of light. And we see St. Matthew here too. There's taking the records of who paid their taxes, there's the money and so on, pointing to St. Matthew, followed you. Whoa. Van Honthorst, the supper party. Look at the light here. A candlelight and another candle over here. That's pretty complex to paint the light from two different sources. And again, like I showed you in the previous painting, the figure closest to the viewer is dark. And likewise here, the idea, the age of light. And one of the things, this is kind of an interruption here. Bronze house. One of the things that they did in Northern Europe, in what's the modern day Belgium and the Netherlands, they started liking to do group portraits. That started to be the style. There's so many examples I could not expect you to know, but the group portraits were really kind of a big thing in Holland. And I would say this, they were kind of a big thing here too. Back in the day when people smoked tobacco, guys do that. Good. I don't get it. But there used to be a real popular brand of cheap cigars, and they were called Dutch Masters. Dutch Masters cigars. And their logo was one of these Dutch group portraits, Dutch Masters. Whoa. Anyway. And you see here, the Archers of St. Hadrian. What happens in this culture is this. They started forming militias and stuff. I told you about some of the incursions of the Spanish Empire into Northern Europe. One of the things that they do in the Netherlands is that they start to organize militias, groups of men there to defend the homeland, the National Guard, if you will. And they were typically of the merchant class. They were typically people who were more well-to-do because mostly they had to finance their own regalia, finance their own weaponry, and so on. And typically, they were connected with the church too. So oftentimes, they would take on names like the Archers of St. Hadrian. And so this is a Frans Hals painting. And here are the women regents of the old men's home at Haarlem. Group portrait, well-to-do, not royalty, but good patriotic citizens. And these are, in their own way, kind of allegories. You know, it's like stand up, make your community better, protect the homeland, take care of the elderly, all of these kinds of things. Got this one here. All of this it's the way the book has it, but Judith Leister. You know, we'll start to see more women artists, more and more and more here. This is finally Renaissance times, women artists, not so much, but eventually women make their mark. And as you can see, every bit as skilled as their male counterparts. And so this is a self-portrait. Judith Leister actually painting a painting. And the two biggest artists of the time, I might add, is this guy, Rembrandt van Rijn. Rembrandt, you know he's got to be big because we call him by one name, like Leonardo, like Raphael, like Donatello, Michelangelo in that category. One of the things that, and this is a group portrait to be sure, and these are medical students. And basically, what they're doing is dissecting a corpse. I know, I should have made you look at this. But you see what he's doing? He's actually pulling apart the arm and showing how the arm is anatomically constructed, with the tendons, with the muscles, with the bone, how all of this connects together. And that's something else that happens in the Baroque. And when they start talking about being excessive and gross and all that other stuff, this is kind of what they're talking about. But bottom line, another group portrait and really a message here. Study medicine. This is the age where we're actually learning things. They're coming out of centuries of putting leeches on people and trying to suck their blood out to relieve the evil humors, you know. No, this is medicine. This is scientific. This is. And so lots of Rembrandt paintings, a lot of stuff to look at. But this is another one of those group portraits. The company of Captain Frans Banning Kolk, and it's subtitled The Night Watch from the Musketeers Hall, Amsterdam, Netherlands, 1642. Zoom in on this a little bit. This is another group portrait, but it's almost satiric. And it is these guys in those groups. Like I showed you about the Royal Archers and all of this stuff, the National Guard, the heroic. These guys are a bunch of bumbling and unorganized clowns, if you will. And you have the two principals here. But then, when they show these other things here, and they have here this guy, what is it right here? He's about ready to shoot off a gun right next to this guy's ear, which is not something you would do. And you see they're checking their muskets. They don't really know what they're doing. They're kind of unorganized. And this little girl here, this is really kind of an interesting thing. She's bringing out food for these guardsmen. If you want to know about this painting, actually, Khan Academy has a really great video on this. I used to show it, but it's kind of long. But at any rate, Rembrandt himself was kind of a iconoclast. He was kind of a rebel. And the weird thing about this is that this was not a particularly flattering portrayal of this outfit. It's actually kind of disorganized and so on. Blinding of Samson, again, talking about light. The light's coming from in here. Return of the Prodigal Son. The self-portrait and here, this is what I wanted to get to. And what? I just played this at home. Let me try it again. Yeah. Well, here's what I want to say. I'll tell you what was mostly in that. Rembrandt, kind of seen as one of the gold standards in terms of painting of 17th century. Very prolific. His style changes over time. You see the early stuff very much more like Rubens, very exact, the action, the drama, the light, everything. See, this is 36, this is 65, 30 years later. This is 60, 25 years later. Notice the difference here? I'll zoom in because this is one of Rembrandt's greatest contributions. He's pretty much stopped using that polished, highly polished, realistic style and started just kind of splashing the paint around. You can see that here. It's almost what we would term a couple of hundred years later, impressionistic. You see all of the gestures. You see it's not clear. It's, for want of a better word, it's kind of sketchy. And generations later, 200 years later, a lot of people will be looking at this and saying, wow, this was genius. And because he was so well versed in being able to make the illusion of space, he was still able to maintain that believability, that idea of three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface. One thing that's been written about a lot, see where my little hand is on there? On the nose. See, that would be a Rembrandt thing. Would take his brush, his white paint, and just pop, put it right on the nose, makes the nose come out, makes it three-dimensional. It's the shine, and it looks natural. It looks real. It looks like three-dimensional space. And so anyway, one of the other aspects of, and this is from 58, so it's kind of when he's getting more gestural. He did a lot of printmaking, Christ with the sick around him, stark contrast, light and dark, theatrical, all of the Baroque characteristics. And that's what I had there. Okay, so I wanted to tell you another little story about Rembrandt. Rembrandt was wildly successful in his own time. He didn't really follow this myth of the starving, unknown artist that only is appreciated after his or her death. He was actually very famous, supported his artwork by teaching young artists at his own art school in Rembrandt. And so one of the things that they did in his school was that the students painted things based on Rembrandt's instruction, and they typically signed the work Rembrandt, or even in some cases, Rembrandt, if he liked the work that the student was doing, would sign his name to it. So that's okay, I guess. So what happens? Well, in the 20th century, scholars started documenting all of these Rembrandt paintings, and there were far more than Rembrandt could have possibly painted in his lifetime. And so what they started, and this was in 1990s, 1980s, late 1980s, they started what was called the Rembrandt Authentication Project, sponsored by the Dutch government, and they wanted to find out which of these paintings were Rembrandt's, which were painted by his students and had the Rembrandt's signature, and which of these were forgeries. So how do you think that went over? Not well. There were a lot of museum collections that own Rembrandts, and here these Dutch scholars are coming around and they're snooping around and they're looking at all of these Rembrandts, and guess what? They de-authenticated tons of these Rembrandts as fakes or student works. Well, what would that mean for the museum? Well, simply put, if they had a real Rembrandt from the 17th century would probably be worth like multiple millions of dollars. If it was done by a student, it was probably worth about $90,000-$100,000. And if it was a fake, it wasn't worth very much at all. So as you might guess, some of the museums that held Rembrandts that were deauthenticated started to push back. One notably was the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They had scholars, as I said earlier, if you're into this, you could actually get a job at a museum. You knew all of the stuff about Rembrandt. Anyway, they had their own scholars and they pushed back, and this went to court. This was like a real mess. But anyway. I got you 2 Rembrandt. There's some other people I want to talk about. However, man, I backed out too much. So let me make sure I got the screen. Looks like I do. I'm gonna launch this on you. It's not due until right before we go on spring break. And actually, it's available till March 10th, which is a Friday. It's due on the 8th, which is a Wednesday. It's the last day before spring break. And so I wanted to give you guys enough time to actually pull this off. And before I begin talking about this specifically, I did look at your quiz 2 submissions. They were mostly pretty good, but there were a small number of ones that had some problems. But see, that's why I'm walking through this. You'll notice as I talk about this paper, it's going to look quite a bit like quiz 1, except expanded. But my purpose was that I get you guys familiar with getting sources and starting to write about work and starting to think about it in multiple ways. Quiz 1, I ask you what you like about it, and then on top of that, give me some historical information, right? Quiz 2, find me some peer-reviewed sources. And that was a learning experience in itself, I think. In that, some of you found that there wasn't much on the work you liked, and some of you came and said, "Could I change my work that I'm researching?" Fine. And so we did learn something. We learned that not all of these works have a lot of research behind it. They do, but it's more a matter of what we can get through the Maryville Library. But we found that out. You guys found it out. You guys did well. One of the things that I found, though, on quiz 2 was I saw some problems with the search words. Of course, I couldn't go back. You guys just gave me the results. But as I was reading through these, I'm finding that at least a couple of you, a few of you, should have given more search terms. For instance, you were researching David statue. We already saw Donatello, Verrocchio, Michelangelo, Bernini. 4 different Davids, all done by Italians. And if you just did David's statue, you may end up getting different ones. That happened in this. In fact, I got one that put the search word in the Last Supper, and now I got sent me 3 articles, but they're about 3 different paintings. And so anyway, but those are the kinds of issues that I want to get cleared up for you now, period. And so that was the method behind the madness. And I'll give you guys more feedback. But like I say, we left it open until midnight last night. And I just, that was it. And so anyway, here is what I want you to do. A 5-page paper. And it's basically asking the second, or how should I say, an extended version of what you did for quiz 1. Now, you don't have to keep doing the same one, but it's going to be a little bit more extensive. Page 1, the history of the artwork, include the era, time period, bibliographic, or excuse me, biographic information on the artist, origins, stuff like that. Huge. And in that, when we talk about the time period or era, I just showed you a Merriam-Webster definition of Baroque. You could do that here. If it was Renaissance, if it was Mannerism, if it was Baroque, High Renaissance, whatever, or moving forward, Rococo, Neoclassicism, Impressionism, and so on. But see, you can really get a lot if you know those words and look them up and then see how those definitions apply to the work you chose. That's what I was trying to sort of model today. High contrast, threw in a few of my own things like the period of the Age of Light, the Baroque Age of Light, the architecture, the Age of the Oval. Those are kinds of things. But, you know, theatrical movement, light, all of that stuff. So that's page 1, analysis of the subject matter. Does the work tell a story or reveal things about the culture in which it was created? Sorry about the space in here. But that's been at least something I've been trying to do in here with you guys. We'll talk about the different attitudes, philosophies, how they come out in Northern Europe, how they show up in Southern Europe. And a lot of these can be attitudes towards the subject matter, even things like nudity or modesty, things like glorification of religion or nobility, or an interest in common, everyday people, places, and things. So we've seen that. And it talked about it, allegory and divinitas. That those terms really apply to a lot of work. We talked about it in the Baroque because they actually come out and put that in the title. But a lot of the work you'll see up to this point and after this point, there are allegories, there are messages, there is what you might call the moral of the story. And so that's really what I'm talking about, stylistic analysis. And I haven't really talked about that too much, but stylistic analysis and formal analysis is basically this, trying to say the same thing two different ways. And this is Khan Academy video, so I'll make sure that
National Gallery in London, standing in front of Giovanni Bellini's The Madonna of the Meadow. This is a Renaissance painting from Venice, but we wanted to talk about it as a vehicle to highlight the tools of visual analysis.
So here's what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about iconography, how this painting fits in with the history of paintings of the Madonna and Child. We're not going to talk about the symbolism that we might see in some of the elements in the back. We're not going to talk about the commission or who the patron was.
We're not going to talk about the political, social, or economic context in which this painting was made. Instead, we're going to focus on the things we can see. So we're going to talk about scale, composition, pictorial space, form, line, color, light, tone, texture, and pattern.
Let's start with the issue of scale. So here we can talk about the scale of the painting and the scale of the figures and what we see in the painting.
We're in a gallery with paintings of all different sizes. There are very large altarpieces and there are some very small paintings as well. This is a moderately sized painting, and it changes where we stand in relationship to the painting. When you stand in front of a very large painting, you tend to stand back. We want to take it all in. Whereas when you walk up to a very small painting, we tend to come in very close to see as much as we can.
We see a female figure is smaller than life size.
But she fills a third of the frame.
And that brings us to the composition. Not only does she fill a third of the frame, but the clothing that she's wearing, the drapery, spreads out across the bottom length of the painting.
Creating, in essence, a pyramid. The base of a pyramid is broad.
And pyramids are a very stable form. We also notice that the child in her lap is contained within the pyramidal shape of her body. So there's an intimacy that's created between the female figure and the child.
The artist has placed her very close to the foreground so that she towers over the horizon line and is clearly the primary subject. But there is also a significant amount of landscape that surrounds her that in a sense frames her. Bellini has created this pyramidal foreground in front of a series of what are really horizontal bands that move back into space. You see a band in the foreground of greenery, then there's a band of pebbles, then there's a band of tilled farmland, and even the clouds create horizontal bands in the sky.
She's framed on one side by trees and on the other side by the vertical forms of the architecture.
Another way we can talk about composition is to think about the way in which the artist has composed the bodies of the figures. Look at the lovely, gentle tilt to the Virgin Mary's head, which corresponds to the angle of the Christ child's head. But I'm also struck by the volume in between the hands of the Virgin Mary, who holds her fingertips together, defining an internal space that has the same kind of volume as her own head and that of the child.
The diagonal line that forms the slope of her right shoulder corresponds to the diagonal line of her forearm and the diagonal line of the child's body. So we have this echoing of forms that helps to unify the composition.
Let's turn next to pictorial space.
We should acknowledge that we're looking at a flat surface, and that what the artist is doing is creating an illusion of three-dimensional form and an illusion of space on this flat surface. Let's start with the figure. She's seated on the ground with a child on her lap. So we have immediately a sense of one thing in front of another because of overlap.
But in addition, pictorial space is defined by what we would call atmospheric and linear perspective. If we look at the sky at the top of the painting, the sky that is closest to us. It has deep, rich blues, and as the sky moves back in space towards the horizon, it becomes paler. Look at the mountains in the distance, how they become paler and bluer. This is a technique that's meant to replicate the natural phenomenon of looking at a great distance, looking through more atmosphere. Details become less vivid, color becomes paler, things become bluer.
We also notice a little bit of linear perspective if we look at the cloud fields, where we see diagonal lines that appear to recede into the distance that lead our eye back into space.
Those lines are called orthogonals. They meet at a vanishing point, which in the context of this painting is excluded by the Virgin Mary and child in the foreground, but which nevertheless creates a sense of logic and places us, the viewer, in a particular point in space in relationship to the image that we're seeing.
Let's turn next to the question of form.
Generally, when we speak about form, we're thinking about the representation of solids in space. And it's instructive to think about the variety of types of form that the artist is representing.
Well, we have the natural forms, we have the trees and grass and fields and mountains and clouds. We also have figurative forms, the Madonna and Child in the foreground, but we also have built forms. We have the architecture in the background. Some of these forms are rounded and curvilinear, like the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, or even the clouds, and some of them are rectilinear, like the architecture in the background.
Some of them feel very solid, like the figures in the foreground. And some of the form is far more delicate. Look at the handling, for example, of the leaves on the trees.
Those forms are established just by touches of color from the artist's brush.
Now, form is often defined by a line.
And in fact, there are contour lines used to demarcate and separate forms. So, for example, separating the Virgin Mary's drapery from the grass that she sits on. And we also have places where we have line on its own, for example, in the branches of the tree. Line is also sometimes the corners of forms, and looking at the line that forms the edge of the squared turret.
Next, we wanted to talk about color.
One is immediately struck by the rich blue of the Virgin's mantle, but also the deep blue of the sky. And that contrasts with the earth colors, the browns and greens that we see in the fields around and behind her.
There are essentially three main color groups. There's the brilliant blue of the Virgin's mantle, of the sky, of the mountains. There's the red of her undergarment. And then there's the yellows of the flesh, of the fields, and of the architecture. These are the three primary colors.
We see white in the shawl that she wears around her head and also in the clouds. So Mary is connected with the heavens.
Color is in some ways a function of light. And here the artist is creating a sense of the broad light of a clear day.
The light from the sun seems to be coming from the left, maybe a little bit forward from the figures.
And high in the sky.
And we see the clouds illuminated from above, they're in shadow below. Similarly with the Virgin Mary, if you look at her right forearm, it's illuminated from above, but in shadow below.
And so the artist is taking pains to create a consistent use of light and shadow. That is, shadow is always in accordance with the source of that light.
Look at the Virgin Mary's face. Her right cheek is illuminated, but the left side of the cheek is in shadow. And we have a sense of moving tones from light into darkness, what art historians often call chiaroscuro. And this helps to create a form that looks three-dimensional, that appears to exist in space.
But light and color are both closely related to shadow and hero.
And tone refers to the amount of light and darkness in a color.
And we can see that in many parts of this painting. We can see it in the cloak of the Virgin Mary. It's probably most subtly handled in the representation of flesh. Looking at the beautiful rendering of the Virgin Mary's face and the smooth brushwork makes me aware of the variety of textures within this painting and the contrast that the artist is creating between the smooth textures of the flesh or of the cloth that the figures wear in comparison to the rough pebbly surface that we see in the middle ground.
Or we could look at the featheriness of the leaves on the trees, which are yet another texture.
Texture is a tool that artists can use to create a sense of veracity as they define different kinds of form.
And texture is intimately related to the materials that the artist is using here. We know it's oil paint, which is well suited to the depiction of different textures.
Let's talk next about tacking. You might not expect to see pattern in a landscape, which is filled with natural forms, because pattern is the repetition of a form over and over again, often to create a decorative field.
Here we see ornamentation in the Virgin Mary's blue robe. We see some gold embroidery.
You look closely, there is a soft organic pattern, especially in the foreground, in the foliage.
We do see the repetition of leaf forms and grass forms that look almost like a carpet, like a decorative field, than the unruliness of nature.
One of the results of pattern is that it is often in conflict with pictorial space, with the illusionistic depth of the artist renders. And even here, it seems as if that green field stands up a little bit in a way that reminds us that this is in fact a two-dimensional surface. So by looking at scale and composition of pictorial space, at form, line, color, light, tone, at textures and the patterns, we have an opportunity to look closely at the painting. But these are only a few of the tools that art historians use to discuss and explore works of art.
So. Angels following the Virgin. So anyway, I thought that would take us up to the end of the class period, and we're not done with this, but I wanted to kind of get you thinking about this, whether or not the artwork that you wrote about in quiz 1, it would actually lend itself to this. And if not, you can change your work of art. That's fine. I just wanted to sort of walk you through the tools and the processes that we use. Did you notice they were using a lot of the same kind of terms that I talked about a lot? The light, the dark, the chiaroscuro, the orthogonals, the art history nerd stuff, but I'm an art history. But at any rate, any questions? And so it's not due until March 10th or March 8th, but turn it in by the 10th. So you got a lot of time, think about it, to knock around. Do you guys mind if I let you go a minute and a half early? I'll take that as a no. I'll see you guys next week. Have a great weekend. It's supposed to be nice. I can't believe we're having such good weather. And Pulpit, you called it, Kansas City Chiefs. Thank you. Thank you. See you, Victor.
Why did every single one of the I put on that one? No, they don't find them out good.